Hello, you're watching EASD Live, and I want to introduce someone rather special to you now. Someone who's been working for 62 years in diabetes research. And if any of you out there can beat that, come along to the studio, because I'd like to talk to you too. This is Barbara Corkey. Barbara,
Hi.
You've been in diabetes all that time.
I have.
What's been of the greatest interest to you in diabetes?
Well, it seemed such an easy challenge to begin with, and the number of different approaches and the complete failure to really have a major impact on the development of the disease, I think is what motivates me the most.
So you've been working since 1957.
Indeed.
In diabetes research.
Right.
And you started, who was your first mentor in diabetes?
Bob Steele.
He of the Steele equation.
Exactly right, at New York University. And in fact, my motivation to go into research was another scientist at NYU called Otto Loewi, who is a Nobel laureate. And he was an old man, I thought, very old at the time, probably younger than I am now. And he was in this, almost looked like a closet, and had a beating heart hanging from a string. And I was amazed. I was a medical student. I walked in there and said, "How do you do that?" And he spent 2 hours showing me how the beating heart depended on calcium. If he took it in or took it out of the perfusion media, it stopped. And I've spent many years working on calcium. So that's one of my earliest interests.
So given nearly 6 decades in research, tell me where you think the greatest need is now and where you think research should be going.
Well, I think we need to really, really look carefully at the things that has changed as this disease progression has gotten worse. And the focus that I've had recently is on processed food. And so the concept of overeating and the concept of too little exercise don't make much sense to me. And as I've looked at the studies evolving, assessing those things, they don't really provide compelling data that this is the right track. And I think the area that really still is wide open and being terribly much ignored is the whole nutritional impact and the environmental impacts. I'm not even sure it's nutritional. The effect of plasticizers, for example, have been discussed a little bit, but there's lots of evidence still missing. Nothing is compelling right now. And I think that's where we need to go. We need to look at the things that have changed that correspond to the increasing incidence of diabetes, both type 1 and type 2, I might add.
So why do you think that nutrition has been ignored? Is it one of those areas of research where the difficulties is as much about the methodologies? Because it's always been so difficult to work in the nutritional area in a scientifically
it is.
Robust
and there's some
way.
Terrible work that's out there. And much of the guidance in nutrition comes from people who are totally uneducated in that area. People read the newspapers to find out what they should or shouldn't eat or which diet works. So it's an area that gets a tremendous amount of misinformation, or at least not scientifically really strong information. And as you point out, the studies are difficult. They're expensive and they're long-term. And nobody profits from them.
And of course, notoriously, people lie, or usually in these circumstances we say fib, as if it was a kind of little white lie, about what they've actually eaten. So nutrition diaries are a nightmare.
I've actually been a co-author on a publication that has many, many, many authors about the fact that the dietary recall instrument that's been used heavily is completely unreliable. But I think it really isn't so much about the little fibs as about the fact that you don't really remember precisely what you ate, and especially 2 days later.
And you
You
might
know,
remember that
you'd almost have to
you ate.
weigh it and photograph
Yes.
it. It
Maybe the
requires a
Instagram
fair.
is actually, social media is the way to
It
do
could
these
be.
things.
That's a better plan.
So, looking back over all your years in research, what's given you most pleasure to see develop?
Well, as a scientist, I love data. And every time people in my lab come to me with data, I get very excited. And so there have been, it's just sort of an ongoing thing. There's not one thing. It's just the continuous building. The realization that I chose to focus on the beta cell. The early training was in liver, and suddenly realized the beta cell, that's where the action is. That's how come I always have come to European meetings, because the beta cell was a much bigger focus here than it was in the US. And so beginning to isolate beta cells and look at the impact of various influences on them, I think one of the recent exciting things have been to show that hyperinsulinemia can be induced in isolated islet cells by simply exposing them to excess nutrient. And that knowledge that most Americans seem to believe insulin resistance is the big problem. I don't agree with that. I think it's hypersecretion of insulin, and I think it's the basal secretion, the fasting levels, that are stressing the beta cell enormously as people become more and more metabolically impaired. So finding that we could do this in 2 or 3 days in isolated cells was really exciting, because it then allowed us to focus on, well, what might be the cause of it.
And there have been many paradigm shifts in thinking about diabetes over the years as well.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, there was a time in the beta cell world where we knew the answer was cytosolic free calcium in response to glucose metabolism, closed KATP channels, and let the calcium in, and then you got secretion. And that was the story. And it was very gratifying to look at the concentration dependence of glucose stimulation and find out it didn't correlate. The answer, it wasn't the whole answer.
Well, thank you for coming to talk to us. It's always a delight to hear someone who's worked for so long in research and has seen so much. And I suspect that you see things coming around all over again sometimes as well. So
it keeps moving. That's the good thing, and it needs to keep moving, because we're not there yet.
Well, thank you very much for being here. So you've heard there from Barbara Corkey, nearly 60 years in research, and let's have more people like Barbara Corkey is what I say. Thank you so much for listening.